Okay, no problem. Okay. Thank you very much for everyone for the participation in this session about the conflict and the macroeconomy. Actually, in this session, we have three speakers. Tabult will talk about civil conflict and exchange rate misalignment. And we have Muhammad Ali Tarabulsi will talk about economic resilience in developing countries. And the last one is Riyad bin Jalili. How he will talk about how does political risk matter for foreign direct investment in Arab economies. So we will take 10 minutes for every speakers, and after these 10 minutes, we will see if we have any question or comments about the topic. We can start with following the order that I have here in the program with Tabult Lumer, civil conflict and exchange rate misalignment.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. I don't know, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the entire ERF team for organizing the conference this year and giving the opportunity to present my paper. So I'm affiliated with University Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne and also Banque de France. Of course, the views are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Banque de France or the Euro system. So recently, we've seen high inflation and large nominal exchange rate movements in many countries from the MENA region, whether gradual depreciations or more large-scale abrupt devaluations. Algeria, Tunisia, devaluation in Egypt in 2016, devaluation a bit earlier in Libya this year, a very recent devaluation in Syria, and I think also one last year, if I'm not mistaken. Sudan, Yemen, etc. I mean, the list is very long. And we've seen also in the recent period a resurgence of civil conflicts. And therefore, the idea of this paper is to study whether there is a relation between the two, whether these large macro imbalances that we see can be explained by, in part by the resurgence of civil conflicts, and what are the implications, if so, for post-conflict transitions. So more specifically, the research question I try to address is whether civil conflict will affect the real exchange rate misalignment in Arab League members, Iran and Turkey. And so here, Palestine, Libya, and Somalia are unfortunately excluded from the sample because of data constraints to compute the real exchange rate misalignment. Otherwise, all the members are included. And so we can observe in almost all countries that the exchange rate regime is quite persistent in each country. But Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi and Raimundo Soto in a paper of 2013 observed that countries tend to adopt a more flexible exchange rate regime during post-conflict transitions. And one interpretation could be that this is reflecting the need to correct these macro imbalances emerging from the conflict. But we have forces triggered by the conflict that could go in both directions. Some forces would lead to a real exchange rate depreciation, a lower foreign aid inflow, lower capital inflows to the country, a declining agricultural intensity and output, an increase in imports, food imports, for example, a decrease in exports, higher demand for military supply and imports will all play towards a more depreciated currency. But there are some opposite forces. An increase in public spending would lead to an appreciation, possibly an increase in remittances to help relatives to cope with the shock, for example, and also higher inflation rates due to shortages of food and basic consumer goods, for example. So the effect is not really straightforward ex ante, and this is why here in this paper I take an empirical approach. So I won't detail the literature to keep time, but the contribution of this paper is to study the monetary and financial consequences of civil conflicts, which is relatively less studied than the implications, the human implications, and for human capital and for physical capital destructions. And also to study the consequences of conflicts in the MENA region and Arab League members countries, which have received relatively less attention than other regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa or specific countries, Colombia, for example, in South America. Also in this paper, I provide country-specific estimations of real exchange rate misalignments over a long period between 1970 to 2018. So I won't show the result, but these are part of the paper. Also this paper contributes to a very narrow literature on the additional determinants of the real exchange rate misalignment. We know that the determinants of the real exchange rate will explain the short-term fluctuation, will explain the real exchange rate misalignment, but not many papers have looked whether other variables will explain this misalignment. So to do so, I use various data sources. So for civil conflict, I use the major episodes of political violence dataset from the Center for Systemic Peace. So this dataset allows to differentiate between violence and wars, and also between civil and ethnic conflict. And for one conflict episode, we can have a variation across years. So this allows to build a country year observations. And the intensity of the conflict ranges between 0 to 10. So 0 of conflict, 1 is sporadic or expressive political violence, and the increasing intensity up to 10, which is extermination and annihilation. And to build the real exchange rate misalignment, so I use the real effective exchange rate from the Bruegel dataset. And for the determinants, I will use commodity term of trade from Gruss and Kebaj from the IMF. I also proxy the international interest rate with a one-year treasury constant maturity rate from the Federal Reserve Freight dataset. Also use net foreign assets and relative productivity from the World Development Indicators, and public consumption and trade openness from the Penn World Table. So very standard macro data sources. And so having a first look at this data, so here I aggregate the intensity of civil conflicts in all the countries from the sample, including, so Palestine is not included in this data set, but including Somalia and Libya, which are then not included. So we see that from a low point at the beginning of the 70s, we have a huge increase in the intensity of civil conflict in the second half of the 70s. And this is sustained throughout the 80s and up to the end of the Cold War. And then we have a very sharp decline over the following decade up to year 2000, with then a rather low plateau between 2000 and 2010. And then from 2011, the Arab Spring, we see another very sharp increase, and then a level that is sustained more or less at the same level as during the 80s. Now, if we look for each country, so the aggregate intensity of civil conflict over the entire period, 1970 to 2018, well, we can see that the entire region has been affected. Very few countries have a zero value. Tunisia and countries from the GCC. And the countries which have been more impacted are, of course, Iraq, Sudan, and Somalia. So then the first step for my empirical strategy is to build the real exchange rate misalignment. So I detailed this in the paper. To keep time for the results, I won't detail it. But if you look at the last line, the idea is that we can express the real exchange rate misalignment as a function of the cyclical component of the determinants of the real exchange rate that are weighted, and I estimate that econometrically, and an error term. And therefore, my research question means, is there a missing variable in this equation? Should we add civil conflict as one of the determinants of the real exchange rate misalignment in the MENA region? We obtain the time series for each country, then we can aggregate. So here I try to aggregate by region. I also, in the paper, you can see whether by oil importing or oil exporting countries, but I won't present it here. So what we can see is that in Iran and Turkey, these two countries have the highest volatility during this entire period. And if we look at the Levant and Iraq, so sorry, I forgot to say, so a value above zero is the equilibrium. A value above zero means that the real exchange rate is overvalued. A value below zero means that the real exchange rate is undervalued. And so in the Levant and Iraq, we can see that from an undervaluation, quite large undervaluation in 1992, we have a steady increase up to a high overvaluation in 2019. If we look at North Africa, we have kind of the opposite. We have a declining trend, and from a slight overvaluation in year 2000 to an undervaluation, but sort of resorbing at the end of the period in 2019. And also what's interesting, I think, is when we look at sub-Saharan African countries that are part of the Arab League, this seems to be the most stable region, with a real exchange rate misalignment that is fluctuating around the equilibrium, with an exception at the beginning of the 90s. So, but more data is provided in the paper. So the empirical strategies is in two steps. So first, I do a simple OLS regression. So I have on the left-hand side the real exchange rate misalignment of country I at year T, explained by the civil conflict in country I at year T, and the short run, so the cyclical components of the real exchange rate determinants. And I also add country fixed effects. So because in the determinants, I have a proxy for the international interest rate, I cannot have a time fixed effect, but I will drop this variable and add a time fixed effect in the OLS just to make sure, and the results are exactly the same. But of course, this equation has potential endogeneity issues, maybe because of missing variable, and also I'm not fully convinced, but maybe because of reverse causality. So I adopt, to try to control for that, an instrumental variable strategy. And so in the first stage, I explained civil conflict in country I at year T by the cumulative intensity of civil conflict in all its neighboring countries, N at year T. And I also keep the additional control variables in the first stage. And then in the second stage, I use the predicted value of civil conflict in country I at year T, which allows to have a causal interpretation of the relation between the two. For this strategy to be valid, two conditions must be satisfied. The relevance conditions, which say that the intensity of conflict in neighboring country must be correlated with the intensity of civil conflict in the country of interest. And this is the case, we can see a positive relationship. Then the exclusion restriction should be met, which is, and I won't present it here, I discuss it in the paper, you can refer to it to save time for the results, but which say that civil conflict intensity in neighboring countries should affect the real exchange rate misalignment in country I only through the increased probability or increased intensity of civil conflict. And I think this is plausibly verified. I argue this in the paper. So to go to the results, so these are the OLS estimates. So column 1 and 2 are when looking at the effect of civil violence on the real exchange rate misalignment. Column 3 and 4, civil warfare, and columns 5 and 6, total civil conflicts, so violence and warfare, and whether civil or ethnic conflicts. And the difference between column 1 and 2, in column 2, I drop the international interest rates, the proxy for this variable, and this allows to add year fixed effects to the country fixed effects. But the results are very similar. And so we see that there is no relation between civil violence and real exchange rate misalignment. There seems to be a positive relation, positive and statistically significant. But then when we mix the two together, this relation disappears. So is it, I mean, and the difference between violence and warfare in the data set is, I mean, it's not fully convincing how it's constructed. So it's difficult to have any interpretation between these two different coefficients. Furthermore, we know that these estimates are very likely to be biased due to endogeneity. So we'll look at the IV estimates. And so they are presented in this table. So in column 1, this is the effect of civil violence on real exchange rate misalignment. We see that the relationship seems to be positive, significant, but the value is very high. And when we look at the first stage, we see that there is no correlation between civil violence in neighboring countries and civil violence in the country of interest. So the first stage is not valid. In column 2, this is the same. So we see no relation between civil warfare and the misalignment. When we look at the first stage, there is a relation that is negative and statistically significant. But if we look at the p-value associated with the f-stat, it is superior to 5%. And therefore, this means that civil warfare in neighboring country and all the other control variables do not jointly explain civil warfare in country I. So the first stage is also invalidate, and we cannot conclude anything. Now, if we look at the third column, there we have more interesting results. In the first stage, we have a positive relationship that is statistically significant, and the f-stat, the p-value associated with the f-stat, is lower than 5%. So there is an association between total civil conflicts in neighboring countries and in the country of interest. And then if we look at the second stage, we see that there is a positive and statistically significant coefficient of total civil conflict in the real exchange rate misalignment, meaning that civil conflict increase the real exchange rate misalignment tend to create a real exchange rate overvaluation in the countries that is affected. So just one last slide to conclude. So this is the main result of this paper at the time, that civil conflict lead to a real exchange rate overvaluation in the MENA region. Through which channel? I think this is, I mean, the work forward for this paper. I haven't done it yet, but the consequence is that the business cycle is impacted during the post-conflict transition because of this real overvaluation. This will possibly lead to a sharp nominal exchange rate depreciation if the exchange rate regime is floating, and or high inflation with a high black market premium if the exchange rate regime is fixed. Since this is a very difficult period, the transition, and imports play a key role, imports of basic products, this will place a very heavy burden on the poorest in the society during this transition. And it can have very large consequences if these imbalances are unaddressed, and I think lead to long-term impacts. So there is this entire literature on the fact that the ultimate determinant of development will be institutions, and nobody fully agrees on what institutions are exactly, but what we know is that, and almost everybody agrees on that, is that these institutions do not evolve a lot over time. They are quite fixed in each country. And a post-conflict transition is right the moment when new institutions are likely to emerge and are likely to stay for a very long time. And if we have this real exchange rate overvaluation that is not addressed, this might fuel discontent, social unrest, and keeping macro imbalances. And this is likely to affect the redistribution of power during that period and how the emerging institution will be shaped. More weight might be given to institutions that aim at ensuring security, stability, security, and much less effort, I will conclude here, and much less effort on those that promote development and checks and balances, for example, and this will have a very, I mean, long-term persistent effect if this is unaddressed. Thank you very much, and where questions and comments are more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sabit. Thank you very much. I open the floor for questions, comments, if you have. Dr. Ibrahim, if you want to.
Thank you very much, Muayyad. Yeah, I very much enjoyed the presentation, and had to admit that I didn't have a chance to read the paper, but I quickly skimmed through it. I think it's a very innovative approach, is to generate real exchange rate misalignment using the modified control group approach, which is really good because it allows you to distinguish between the long run time invariant determinants and then the short run time dependent determinants, and then to generate the misalignment and then use the second stage, the instrumented civil war intensity or civil war measures. I think I just have one comment about that. There may be some, beyond just the neighboring countries as an instrument, perhaps maybe there are some other factors that are external to the determinants of the exchange rate, maybe, just such as the social diversity. Countries which are affected by social polarization or fractionalization are likely to be more prone to conflicts, but it is not clear whether this will have any impact on the exchange rate. So maybe you might want to consider some of these variables that might actually have an also the topography. Countries which are endowed with hills and the war technology, so to speak, hills and forests and so on, which are prone to so some of these might be legitimate instruments that are external to the exchange rate determination. But my overall comment is that this is most interesting paper. I think it's great to have such kind of papers that addresses this issue, because it is, as the paper shows, is a phenomena that is particularly different for the countries affected. The second point is just, since you actually identified countries in the region that are affected by conflicts, you might actually want, rather than lumping the countries into groups, and they are different, because Yemen and Iraq are oil producing countries, but they are, so you might want actually to show the individual countries' performance vis-a-vis countries which do not experience a civil war.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you.
Dr. Muayyad, can I bring your attention to a question that's set out in the chat by Dr. Saif Abdurrahman?
Okay, we have to read the chat question.
Yeah. And we may want to ask participants, should they wish to have questions, to put it in the Q&A button so that the panelists can get easier access to it, or they can raise hand and we'll give them the floor to put their questions directly to the panelists.
Yeah, Mr. Saif asking about the causality link between conflict and exchange rate misalignment. It's not straightforward. And here more variables are needed, particularly the variable balance during, before, and after the conflict. So to see the actual causal relation. Yeah, it's the question about the causal relationship between exchange rate and misalignment and conflict. The question of Mr. Saif Abdurrahman.
Can I respond to
yeah,
comments and questions?
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Dr. El Badawi. I mean, I got really inspired by your work on this topic and the methodologies that you use of the way to compute the real exchange rate misalignment. So really an honor to receive your comments. So actually, on your second point, the individual dynamics, I provide this in the paper in the appendix, but it's I mean, the format is too short to show this this in the presentation. Then your first point is to use a different instrument, I think. If I understood well, to use social fragmentation, for example, or to use the typography of the country as an instrument for civil conflict. But econometrically speaking, I think the concern would be that this is not a time variant, and this is a country fixed effect. It would be captured by a country fixed effect. And I don't know if it's really feasible to do that.
But you already controlled for the fixed effect, right?
Yes, I already control for fixed effect in all the regressions. But I will think more of this and see if I can still improve the methodology. Then the question from Mr. Saif Abdurrahman. I'm sorry for the pronunciation. Well, the causal relationship. So I think this results evidence this relationship. Now, to what is it due exactly? I think this is the way forward to see the transmission mechanisms. I haven't really checked that yet, and this is part of the next steps. Now, several financial flows, and for example, the foreign exchange reserves, I have to check if it's really included, but some of them will be captured by the control variable, which are the determinants of the real exchange rate. So their short-term fluctuations will be as control variables already in the regression. And sorry, the question is a bit longer. Maybe I will answer in the chat
Okay.
in the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thabit. Thank you.
Dr. Muayyad, can I remind you if you'd like to share your own comments on the paper, or do you plan to?
Yeah, I have. Actually, I read the paper. It's interesting. I like it. I have just one suggestion regarding the methodology. Just I'm wondering if we can make the interaction term between the conflict and the business cycle. This is my suggestion. If we can include the interaction term between the conflict variable and the business cycle, this will take the paper to another place where we can identify the total impact of conflict and business cycle on the real exchange rate misalignment. My second comment is regarding the parallel market exchange rate. You know, most of the Arab countries, the business cycle is affected by the black market exchange rate, not by the official market exchange rate. But I don't know, when you build your variable for the real exchange rate, which one you use. For example, for Lebanon, for Syria, for Iraq, for many countries in Arab region, the business cycle is more affected by the parallel market one, not by the official one. So just I have these two comments, might you take it into your consideration. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. For your second comment, I think so I take the Bruegel dataset. I think this is captured when they compute the real effective exchange rate. But you are right, in a country as Lebanon, for example, currently, I will check that again. I think it is captured, but I will check again. Thank you very much for this comment.
Okay, thank you very much. Now maybe we can move to
Dr. Muayyad, we can't hear you. Dr. Muayyad?
Yes, I'm sorry. Maybe I put it mute. We will move to the second presentation presented by Mohammed Tarabulsi about economic resilience in developing countries.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Muad. I shared my presentation. It's clear?
Yeah, it's clear.
Thank you very much. My paper.
May you please bring your voice closer to the speaker so it's clearer?
Now, good.
Yeah, it's a bit far.
Yeah.
The paper that I present examines the role of democracy in strengthening the resilience of developing economies in the face of exogenous negative external shocks. In this study, we use the duration model to estimate how democracy can determine the probable duration of spell of economic growth. Our problematic revolves around three questions. Why do different countries react differently? Do democratic institutions support economic growth despite negative external shocks? And how does democracy contribute to improving the resilience of these countries? In the literature, we have two contradictory theoretical points of view. The first point reveals that democracy facilitates the establishment of resilient institutions and policies that mitigate the effects of negative shocks. The second point reveals that democracy has the disadvantage of slowness and complexity in decision making, which prolong the duration and negative consequences of the economic crisis. In this paper, we test the hypothesis that democracy is a resilience factor and that it increases the country's ability to sustain growth periods following an adverse external shock. In this paper, we'll retain the definition of BERT 2012, which assumes that the resilience of an economy indicates the capacity to support longer periods of expansion. So to elaborate this paper, we use this model based on the variable distribution. So we choose the dependent variable, the probability that sustained economic growth will end, and we assume that the failure times associated with the duration of failure G is expressed as a product of a random variable 2G and a proportionality scale, which is a function of the weighted sum of the sets of an independent variable X is. Our database concerns 96 developing countries in 1965-2015, according to work made by Bergall 2011. The country is considered to have achieved sustained growth if it records a regular growth rate of GDP per capita greater than or equal to 2% over a period. The duration of continuous periods of accelerated growth can be interpreted by exogenous shocks, particularly in the most vulnerable countries. Growth spells start with an increase of at least 2% in real GDP per capita and end with a decrease followed by growth periods of less than 2% on average. For this model, we use some variable shown table 1 related to democracy, electoral democracy, participation democracy, and other variables. And we found some results of table 2 shows the duration and frequency of GDP per capita growth spells. So if I take, for example, this number for Asia, it represents other regions, Africa and Latin America, have short average growth. For Latin America, 8.2 years, and for Africa, 6.4 years. This for this figure, so we found that democratic countries have higher children rates than authoritarian countries. So democracy in red and authoritarian in blue. To estimate this model, we find this coefficient from the coefficient of the table for show the regression coefficient, which can interpret it as risk ratios. The factor by which risk rate increases when the cover rate increases by unit one. For example, if the risk ratio for example, in red for inflation, 1.3 means that the change of 1 unit in the regression increases the risk of slowing growth by 3%. If I take for quality, 0.92 is a coefficient less than 1, so it denotes a growth protection effect. And if a risk ratio of 1 is equal to 1, means there is no effect. So in this table, we can conclude that the variable quality in yellow associated to democracy increases in the expected duration of growth spell with a percent equal to 8%. The result of this table 4, because the hypothesis that democratic countries tend to respond better face of negative external shocks. The result also highlights the beneficial effect of improving political institutions, making them more democratic, and improve the terms of trade. And finally, allow inflation generally prolongs period of growth as shown as in this table. In conclusion, the duration of accelerated growth periods can be interpreted by exogenous negative shocks, particularly in the most vulnerable countries, According to our hypothesis, democracy has an impact on the length of growth period in developing countries, vulnerable to exogenous negative shocks, showing that democracy is likely to protect the growth process of this country. The second point, our results show that democracy significantly extends the duration of growth period. This promotes more resilient and more sustainable growth. However, our analysis may be subject to further investigation. More variables that account for major shocks, such as political and civil strife, internal conflict, should be included. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Muayyad, the floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Trabalsi.
Thank you.
Now, if you have any questions or any comments on the economic resilience in the Arab countries. Professor Ibrahim, would you like to comment?
Yes, actually, I like the technology, the regression, the methodology that was used, and the linkage to Danny Roderick's contribution to this, because Danny Roderick was one of the early authors who argued that even if autocracy and democracy does not distinguish itself to be a better promoter of growth than autocracy, it has one advantage, that sustainability of growth. And I think what Dr. Trabalsi and his colleague have presented is very good articulation of this using a more sophisticated model. You know, the growth spell and the probability model that they used, and then of course applying that to a growth regression. So I think this is very good. I didn't have a chance again to read the paper, and it's not very familiar to me as the earlier paper, so I could not go give justice to the paper, but I could see that it is really an important contribution, and it's a very good paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ibrahim.
Thank you, Mr. Ibrahim.
May I remind you, Dr. Muayyad, of your own comments and request Dr. Trabalsi to stop sharing screen?
Maybe we can.
Actually, he is hearing you. If you can stop sharing screen, Dr. Trabalsi. And actually, I read the paper very quickly just last day. I like the paper, I like the topic, but I have some comments on the paper, Professor Trabalsi. In general, I can say it's the topic is very clear, excellent topic, and highly relevant for the Arab countries. I read the literature review is a bit long and needs to be restructured by putting some examples which is similar to the Arab countries' cases. Again, I'm not familiar with the probability sophisticated model that if you used, but for me, the empirical methodology wasn't very clear. Which methodology did you use for the estimation results? It's an OLS, pooled mean group, or augmented mean group. This is very important. It should be very clear in the paper. And if you allow me, finally, again, as Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, it's very good if we can see the individual countries, because some of the estimation techniques that we used in this panel estimation maybe hide the individual features of each country. and maybe some common features are exist, or some cross-sectional dependence are exist between these countries. So the overall, the paper is very good. And just if you can make it more clear relating to the estimation methodology in the paper, that would be highly appreciated from you. Thank you very much again, Dr. Tarabulsi.
Thank you, Mr. Moyad. It's possible to introduce a panel data after revolution, after 2011, and introduce some Arab countries. But I think the problem is enormous. If I take the case of Tunisia, we had a shock in 2011 due to the revolution, but economically, we cannot overcome this shock because there are some other variables which affect democracy as religion, as political Islamism. I suppose this variable can affect enormous the democracy. If I see the example of Egypt now, of Egypt with a positive growth, Egypt has the possibility to overcome this problem of interaction between system, political, and political stability in each country.
Yes.
But this model we can use this model in crisis. For example, the pandemic crisis now. We can ask why some countries overcome this crisis of pandemic and other countries not arrive to overcome this problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you allow me,
Yes, yes.
Moyed,
Please go ahead.
I think one point that I wanted to mention, and which I like most of the in the paper, is that the paper defines 3 types of democracy: electoral democracy, participatory democracy, and egalitarian democracy. And only the last 2, participatory and egalitarian, have had significant impact in preserving the gross spell, or in enhancing the gross spell. I think this is a very important contribution, because if you look at Tunisia now as an electoral democracy, the problems they are facing will be quite relevant to the evidence of this paper, because what they need is some sort of a social contract building on the electoral democracy to develop participatory or egalitarian democracy. And I think this would be quite interesting. And I don't know whether Dr. Tarabulsi have actually, and his colleague, have articulated this finding the practical experiences of a recent democracy, which is the Tunisian democracy, and why they are unable to make success in terms of growth, perhaps because it's a purely electoral democracy, and they are yet to build upon it to reach the status of egalitarian or participatory democracy. So I think this is very useful finding, which has far-reaching implications, I think, for the region.
Thank you very much, Professor Ibrahim. Do you want to add something, Professor Tarabulsi?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Just if you can please stop sharing the screen from your side.
Okay.
And we still have some time. If you have any comments, any questions, please. If you don't have, we will move to our last speakers for today. Dr. Riyad Benjalili. He will present how does political risk matter for foreign direct investment into Arab economies. Please go ahead, Dr. Riyad. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. So a paper is not necessarily connected to the other two papers. So first of all, I would like to thank you all very much, and especially for the organization of the ERF, as usual. Dr. Ibrahim and in particular Huda Azmi, the quality of the connection, the quality of the follow-up, etc. It's highly, highly professional, and highly appreciate, as usual, this type of follow-up, and also the professional act in indicating the distribution of sessions, etc. To you or to all the organizers, I would like to thank you very much. So my paper is linked to the attractiveness of FDI in the Arab region, based on macroeconomic perception in terms of project, the Greenfield FDI project, and in relation with how we appreciate the political risk and how political risk can influence or can have or impact the possibility of attracting foreign direct investment. My presentation will follow 4 steps. First of all, some motivation for that. After that, some words in terms of methodology, the estimates, results, and after that, the policy recommendation from this paper. The political landscape in the Arab region has undergone considerable change over the last decade in response to the massive and also unexpected wave of social and political unrest. This changing political landscape, combined with the continuing geopolitical tensions in the Middle East and also the more recent COVID-19 sovereign risk impact, sparked uncertainty about the economic outlook and also led to an increased exposure to political risk of foreign companies conducting businesses with or in the Arab countries. And in this paper, a very broad definition of political risk is adopted as the probability of politically motivated change that affects the outcome of foreign direct investment. And that includes potential restriction on the transfer of funds, products, technology, and people, uncertainty about policies regulation, and finally, risks on control of capital. Wars, revolution, social upheavals, strikes, and also terrorism are actually part of political risks as taken into account by the MIGA, for example, or Daman. Likewise, the demand of the market capacity and the market capacity for the political risk assurance coverage have jointly increased considerably over the recent years. The market capacity has surpassed actually 3.2 billion, in particular in 2019, the last available data, almost 2.7 times the capacity available a decade ago. And the volatile and uncertain political and institutional environment represent a major concern for companies in a wide range of industries. This is particularly supported by the Global Investment Competitiveness Survey results, which is commissioned by the World Bank Group to capture the perceptions of global investors on the role of investment climate factors in guiding their FDI decisions. And over 90% of investors rate various types of legal protections as critical, including ability to transfer currency in and out of the country, as well as legal protections against expropriation, breach of contract, non-transparent or arbitrary government conduct. So, understanding and evaluating the impact of political risk on the level of composition and the composition of inward FDI flows is therefore particularly relevant in Arab region, where investor perceptions of institutional risks remain elevated and where also informal barriers to invest are higher than elsewhere. So the Arab region provides also a relevant context to test for sector specificity in the relationship between FDI and political risk. And the countries in the region have very diverse characteristics in such key areas as structure of economies, natural resource endowments, and type of governance and institutions, which contributes to better identification. This paper addresses the following research question in the context of the Arab region. How does a host country's political instability and institutional fragility affect the bilateral inward greenfield FDI project? Is there any sectoral specificity to this impact if it exists? And which components of political risks poses the most threat to the foreign investor in a specific sector? And in like the analysis conducted by Berger and al. From the World Bank in 2016, where the baseline economic strategy ignores the possible heterogeneity of FDI from different sources, a gravity model approach is adopted here to empirically investigate the possible answer to the above research questions. And for that purpose, so an annual panel dataset on greenfield FDI projects in Arab countries from 2003 to 2018 have been assembled from an online database developed by the FDI Intelligence specialist division of the Financial Times, which monitors cross-border investments in new projects and expansions of existing ventures, covering all sectors and countries worldwide since 2003. The data contain information on countries of origin and destination, provides other relevant information such as investment date, capital expenditures, employment, sector, and business activity undertaken by the foreign affiliates. And in this paper, only greenfield FDI projects, so around more than 1240 exactly projects, are considered to eliminate concerns that heterogeneity of FDI in driving the results and the possibility that investments reflects repairs and facilities associated with prior investment rather than new projects. So during the period 2003-2018, it's important to note that this mode of foreign capital entry was also the mode preferred by the multinational investors in the Arab countries, accounting for more than 85% of total FDI projects in average. Moreover, many policymakers, be they from Arab region or elsewhere, are particularly interested in attracting these new FDI projects. The considered empirical strategy builds, as I said before, on the gravity model, often used to explain the bilateral trade flows and relatively recently extended by different scholars to model FDI flow or stock, bilateral FDI flow or stock movements. It is also assumed after linearization that the logarithm of adjusted parameters, endogenous parameters, by a certain proportion of the difference between the desired and the actual capital in each period. And the idea behind the adjustment process is that the new greenfield FDI is fully effective only after a learning or installation period due to relatively higher sunk cost of physical investment. And to better understand how each aspects of political risk affects FDI projects in the host country, the paper uses comprehensive measures of political risk compiled from two main sources: the Political Risk Services PRS group, one of the leading providers of country risk data, and Heritage Foundation database. Principal components analysis is at the second time performed to produce components that can explain as much variance as possible in the selected political risk variables. And for the full set of the selected variables, it was found that 3 components or factors have eigenvalues close or above 1, accounting for 78% of the total variability in the data. Each component has been entitled in a way that best reflects the risk category proxied by the variables representing the components. And the first component rather reflects expropriation or breach of contract risk considerations. The second component refers to transfer convertibility risk. And the last component measures war and political violence risk. And apart from the interest political risk variable and the log population of weighted distance between home and host countries, this paper considers the following control variables or set of control variables to account first for macroeconomic consideration, for trade consideration, for proximity between countries, and finally, to take into account the global effect of FDI. So to explore whether the association between the political risk and new FDI depends on the supply of greenfield funds, the log of interaction of political risk with aggregate new FDI into the Arab region has been introduced as a control variable following the work of Meon and Sekat. And the components of the log of interaction terms were demeaned prior to the interacting them in order to facilitate the interpretation. So if the sensitivity of greenfield FDI flow to local political risk decreases when greenfield financing in the region is abundant, so it means that the impact of the interaction term should be positive. If, however, foreign investors are more sensitive to local political risk when capital in the Arab region abounds, in this case, the impact should be negative. The logarithm of greenfield FDI inflows per capita is constant in constant million US dollars is employed as the dependent variable in the following regressions. According to me, normalizing by adjusting for population size instead of GDP is a preferable strategy since many of the dependent variables typically included in FDI analysis can be expected to influence GDP. And the estimation of the dynamic gravity equation requires to address some important econometric challenges, such as heterogeneity of FDI data, the dynamic panel basis from the use of lag dependent variable or the nickel bias, and the treatment of zero bilateral FDI flows. So wherever possible, these challenges are gradually addressed in the paper. And accordingly, both linear and nonlinear methods were considered in order to give a proper account for the patterns of heteroscedasticity characteristics in FDI data, and also for the protrusion of the occurrence of zeros in the considered greenfield FDI database. So several findings stand out. First, Starting with the result of main interest, political risk is negatively correlated with the greenfield FDI flows per capita, regardless of the estimation method used. And the effect of political risk is consistently statistically significant and 1% significant levels. And controlling for economic factors, as is done in specification exposed in column from 3 to 5, does not attenuate this relationship, and quite the contrary, significantly strengthen it. So the absolute value of greenfield per capita FDI flows elasticity to political risk score more than a 4-fold increase by the SGMM estimates. And furthermore, based on the full specification, the estimates from column 3 to 5 on the standard gravity variables are mostly as expected. Okay, so I think that I don't have a lot of time. So for the other variables, for the other components, you can follow me by reading the paper. Okay, but the most important thing is to really to focus on the political risk impact. So I go with the nonlinear perception or nonlinear results exposed in this table, which reports the estimation outcome resulting from the pseudo-Poisson maximum likelihood and Ekman techniques. So overall, compared to the linear estimates, the estimation procedures by these techniques seem to affect the magnitude, but not the sign of the parameters for most gravity variables, and in particular, the parameters of interest in the evaluation of political risk impact. And as expected, the perceived political risk in the Arab host country reduces significantly greenfield FDI inflows, regardless of the estimation method used. And while the sensitivity of FDI to local political risk decreases when global volume of foreign investment in the considered Arab region is abundant. However, the interaction term is highly significant only when the Heckman model is considered. The Heckman model predicts that political risk affects negatively and significantly both the likelihood of the non-zero bilateral source host greenfield FDI and also the volume of FDI flows within the pair. And the sensitivity of new FDI flows to local political risk decreases when FDI is abundant, since the coefficient of the interaction variable, as explained before, is significantly positive. In the selection stage, all the explanatory variables are highly significant, and sample selection only creates a bias in if the error term of the two equations in Heckman model are correlated. That is the case because that information is contained in the parameter rho, whose estimate 0.66 is statistically highly significant, suggesting that sample selection is a major issue in the considered data sets. The Heckman regression is replicated considering 3 major categories of political risk as independent variables rather than one composite indicator. So the purpose is to identify the components of political risk that matter most for bilateral greenfield FDI. And the rationale behind such test is the argument that the effect of political risk depends upon the extent to which a specific components of political risk pose a continuous risk to business activity and not a sporadic effect only. So only these types of political risk may affect foreign firms' location, choice strategies, and or the level of capital expenditures. So in line with the intuition, the through components, expropriation, breach of contract, transfer convertibility, and war political violence risks have a negative and 1% statistical significant impact on the probability that bilateral investment takes place. However, only the transfer convertibility risk negatively and significantly affects the level of foreign investments made. So the conditional marginal effect of these components of political risk is very close to that, to the one that we have estimated with the composite index. And a 1% increase in the transfer convertibility risk score results in a decrease of 0.82% compared to 0.9% previously with the composite index as presented before. The Ekman sample selection specification is also separately estimated for Greenfield FDI project into natural resources and energy, non-resource manufacturing, tradable services, and non-tradable activities. So taking into account the heterogeneity between different sectors. And the finding controlling for size of the market, bilateral trade, language, geographical distance, regional trade agreement, industrial activity, and so on, reveal striking differences from sector to sector as concerns the relevance of home country political risk components in the two-step decision of foreign firms on FDI in the Arab countries. While FDI participation probability is strongly negatively correlated with at least two of the three political risk components, irrespective of the investment sector, the size of the FDI projects in resources and energy sector has the particularity of being insensitive to any component of political risk. So, from this paper, several policy implications emerge. The first one, because political uncertainties vary by sector and political risk components, it is imperative to collect and examine disaggregated new FDI projects and political risk data when analyzing FDI in Arab countries. Second, institutions offering investment guarantees, as I said, as MEGA, must recognize the differential exposure and sensitivity of foreign firms to political and institutional fragility when pricing risk and taking into account the development objectives of these institutions. Third, political risk appears most detrimental to those types of investment that the Arab region most needs, notably in labor-intensive and high-technology tradable manufacturing and tradable services industries. Greenfield FDI in these activities could foster structural change and also help countries create middle to high-skilled and higher wage jobs. So FDI in non-tradables is also sensitive to political and institutional uncertainties, particularly those relating to transfer and convertibility risk. However, this type of investment is largely based on market-seeking motives and hardly contributes to structural change. Likewise, FDI to resource-rich countries can hamper rather than facilitate countries' effort to escape the resource trap or Dutch disease. And last but not least, the efforts of Arab countries to diversify and attract FDI into manufacturing and tradable services sectors has to be accompanied by effort to improve political stability and also institutional quality. An adapted political risk insurance targeting prospective investors in a specific sector is an additional important factor worth looking into when balancing the risks investors face and also the gain that they anticipate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Riyad. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. Now we will move to the comments on this paper. Okay. I have some comments. I read the paper very quickly. Actually, I like the paper. The topic is very nice and very clear, which the debate about the impact of political instability on FDI, it's very interesting for the Arab region. The using of the empirical methodology was very suitable for this paper. The empirical techniques, it's very up to date. I mean, the using of augmented mean group give a solution for many challenges that facing the traditional paneled estimation. The only things here that was I'm wondering about it, if we can, as I know, the augmented mean group can provide country by country. So if we can see the picture by looking at the country by country for this estimation, it will give a value added for this paper. Another point, it's relating to the interaction terms. The interaction terms is not very clear in the paper. I didn't understand the interaction terms. It's between which variable? It's between the political risk and the lagged value of the political risk. If it's the case, I suggest to make the interaction, as I read in some paper, between the political risk and the domestic GDP. And then we can see how the complete impact of the political risk and its impact on the political GDP on the foreign direct investment. This is could be a very interesting point in this paper. Finally, for the nonlinear model, again, I didn't understand your nonlinear model. Did you use the squared of the political risk? I mean the political risk itself and the square of the political risk, or you check for the asymmetric impact of political risk on the foreign direct investment. If you can just clarify these things, but overall the topic is very relevant. You cover many interesting things in this paper. The policy implications are very attractive using up-to-date and recent techniques in econometrics. Thank you very much. I like your paper, Professor Riyad.
Thank you very much. So do I respond immediately, or I wait for other comments?
Yeah, you can respond.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for your interest. And of course, this is the most important motivation when you present a paper or you present a works, is that you motivate the persons who are in charge of analyzing and to critique also the paper, insisting on a country by country analysis. As you know, I have a database which is focused on a project type, and I can do it, but I don't have enough time series in this case, from 2003 to 2018, in order to generate enough statistical capacity to analyze the non-observed variable and non-observed components in this analysis, and also to have the possibility to identify the impact, the differentiated impacts in terms of sectors, in terms of country, in terms of country of origins. And that's why it's preferable in econometrics to use a much bigger picture, a much bigger information system, but conditional on the fact that we are always able to analyze the interaction terms and the individual part from the sector, from the temporal parts, etc. It's not an easy task, but I think that we gain in terms of degree of freedom by doing that, than by isolating country by country. But in AD also, you have many countries in the Arab regions. In the Arab region, you can have 4 groups, and yeah, in each group, you have something which seemingly related, okay? And this can contribute to a better efficiency in terms of estimation process. Yeah. The interaction term, for the interaction term, the idea beside the interaction term is to know if the bulk of investment, the amount of investment, previous investment in the region contribute to decrease the impact of the political risk components or not. So when you are used to invest in the region with a big amount, in this case, we can say that probably we have a learning process which give us less impact in terms of political risk. Okay, so this is the idea. The idea is to aggregate the flow of FDI projects, the flow of FDI, greenfield FDI in the region, okay, and to demean it and to have an interaction process to see if this interaction process contribute to give us an explanation, a non-linear or non-linear explanation of the impact of political risk. Because in case that this interaction exists and is significant, it means that your analysis will depend on a time, on a specific time, on a specific period, okay? Are you in a specific period where you are capturing a lot of investment compared to the other countries or not? Okay, so, and it is in this case, of course, it's a sort of economy of scale, certain sort of economy of scale, which can, in a certain circumstances, decrease significantly the impact of the political risk or the perception of the political risk. Non-linearity to the linearity, excuse me, I'm very sorry. Probably because I'm not very clear in my presentation. By non-linearity, I mean the process of modeling the decision. Okay, in a Poisson model, the variable, the endogenous variable, okay, in this case, is non-linearly considered. Why? Because in this case, we take into account the fact that the zero information, in this case, is a structural information incorporated in the analysis. And of course, in this case, we don't have a linearized model. This is the same thing for the Heckman model, because the Heckman model, estimated in one time, in maximum likelihood in this case, suppose two phases. First of all, you define if you are attractive for the investment or not. Okay, so the probability to attract the investment, the FDI project, and conditional on this probability, okay, you define the amount that you attract. Okay, so in this case, you don't have a linear program, you don't have a linear function, you don't have a linear model. Okay, compared to the first model, which is linearized and estimated by the least square, adapted to the panel data or a gravity model, and also estimated by the system GMM, okay, which also is linear, okay, as a perception of modelization process. That's what I mean by a linear or non-linear, okay?
I think Dr. Riyad, you also have a question through chat from Dr. Saif.
Dr. Saif.
If you can get it, fine. Otherwise, I could read it for you.
Okay, Saif, dear Riyad, thank you for this important topic. I have a direct question. Is there some categories of FDI sensitive to political and conflict risk? In Africa, for example, some investments like in mining sectors are sensitive to conflict and there are the conflict associated with the FDI. Is such phenomena applicable in MENA countries? Could you explain why using population size as proxy? Okay, yes. The aim of this paper is to define that we have a differentiation between different sectors. Of course, I don't take into account a lot of sectors. I aggregated sectors in 4 components, in 4 big or broad sectors. The idea is to have this differentiation, to introduce this differentiation. And the most important thing is that when we are focusing on resources as oils or mines, etc., or mining sector, etc., we see that we don't have this sensitivity. Okay, the impact of political risk is very limited. So it means in this case that we have something else which explain the attractiveness in this sector, and probably because the resources are rare. That's why. And in this case, the strategy of the investor probably will be a strategic relationship with the persons in charge in terms of political decision in order to be able to enter these markets. That's what we observe, for example, in the GCC countries when we are in with the oil activity. We know that we cannot invest in the oil activity without any a political connection, a direct political connection with these countries. So this is approximately what we observe in this paper. But for the other sectors, and particularly the manufacturing sector, we observe that we have a significant impact of political risk. And in this case, it is very important to take into account the importance of this sector by offering the management style adapted to attract this type of investment, or by enhancing the institutional and the political environment in this country. Why could you explain why using population size as a proxy? I use population size as the proxy to manage the difference between different countries in terms of attracting FDI. So you have differences in terms of amount of FDI attracted from one country to another. And when we control, or when we use population size as a proxy in this case, we have a dimension which can which give me, from an econometric point of view, more I will be more able to focus on the structural impact, on structural parameters which explain the attractiveness process and the existence of this bilateral change between one host country and source country, independently on the big amount of the difference in terms of amount attracting between different countries. And we observe in Arab countries effectively that the amounts are really very divergent, very different from one country to another. That's why. And I prefer to use the population than the GDP for the same reason, because the GDP in this case could be correlated with many other variables taken into account in the gravitational model.
Thank you very much, Professor Riyad. If you have any question, any comments?
I have only a small comment question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So thank you very much. I found that, well, this paper and the previous one also very interesting. I didn't have the time to read them, but I will do so to really understand all the refinements. I understand. So you decompose the political risk into three different components, and you presented the results where you have the three of them included in the same regression. But I think, isn't there an econometric problem? Because, for example, if you have a war, this increases the risk of expropriation, for example. So they are correlated. And wouldn't it make sense to add them one by one to be able to see the differences in magnitude, for example? Which ones are still significant, and compare the magnitude between them?
Yes, exactly. But before that, we have a principal components analysis to define the three effects or the three components. Okay, and of course we have certain correlation between each components, but these correlations are not enough in order to introduce a collinearity and the high collinearity in terms of estimation process. And the idea is just, for example, to delete one component, for example, and to estimate and to see what happened to the estimating process. The estimate process is still robust, is still stable, even when we proceed to that. But of course, I prefer to, why do I prefer to introduce these components? Because first of all, at the guarantee industry, these types of risks are highly identified by a contract, contractually speaking. So when we differentiate these type of risk exactly, and we want to know if the impact is differentiated or not, given the principal components analysis before that, in order to establish a direct link with the contract, which is practical in these companies. In the company where I worked before, in Daman, the operation department is highly interested to know what is the contribution of each components or each type of risk in terms of FDI, in terms of FDI attractiveness or FDI flows. So that's why. But when you introduce these components by components, you don't have really a significant impact linked to the collinearity or the correlation present, which is here, but not significantly important between these two components.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Riyad. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your help.
I think if you don't have any question, any comments, I would like to thank you all the speakers about this great offer, this very nice topics and participation. We have the best of luck for you. And
we'd like to thank you, Dr. Muayyad Samra, for excellent moderation. Much appreciated. Huda will be in touch with each of the authors requesting the updated document to be submitted for the working papers. And you'll be very encouraged to submit an article for the forum. We're very keen to make sure that the research that's generated is actually, we're maximizing on its outreach. So it would be great to get an article to actually reflect on that. And I'd like to thank you for today's session, and the recording was going to be availed shortly after the session. And you'd be invited to join us for the next couple of ones coming for the rest of the week. We continue with Dr. Ibrahim's favorite topic on conflict. So tomorrow there's a session on conflict and institutions at 4 o'clock. Very interesting discussions moderated by Dr. Khaled Abu Ismail and Dr. Vladimir. We had some of the authors for the papers attend today's session, so I see the interest in that topic being continued. There's going to be some issues of corruption, economic, social, and institutional determinants, and some of understanding of the external shocks are amongst the topics that are going to be discussed tomorrow. And on Thursday would be our final session on conflict-related matters. With Dr. Bilal Falah moderating the session. And we've got 3 papers then as well, talking about the new dividing line, talking about cash-based assistance, talking about gender gap. So really interesting topics, very much related to your areas of interest. So a cup of coffee and see you on tomorrow and after tomorrow at 4 p.m. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you.
To actually, if I may, to follow on Shireen to say that actually all 3 papers are extremely important, and I think they come up with a message that would constitute a very good contribution to the forum. A column based on each one of these. I think by the three set of authors would be really highly appreciated. I could say that, for example, the issue of democracy, what type of democracy that can actually be good for growth. I think this is a very important issue for the region. And then, of course, the issue of the macro stability as reflected by the exchange rate, and associated with conflicts. And then last but not least, the great work of Riyad. And in fact, I'm tempted to ask you, Riyad, about if you had done anything linking the impact to the decision by countries. I don't know whether it is countries or companies to ensure using, for example, the Inter-Arab Investment Guarantee Corporation. You are still in the Inter-Arab Guarantee Corporation, right?
No, I left. So actually, I'm part of University de Bretagne Sud. I come back to my university.
Okay.
Right.
So I think it would be interesting also because this would be like a treatment, like a treatment effect.
Yes.
And the extent to which, some sort of a difference in difference
Absolutely.
might allow testing, the extent to which the insurance has been effective or something like that.
Absolutely. I have a work actually in progress publication after the revision, but it concerns trade. It concerns trade and trade and political and commercial risk. Okay, and the action of or the intervention of multilateral development companies, the ISEC and Daman. And how is the impact of these companies in terms of export performance? Okay, so it is actually in publication process with your review.
I think just again to follow on Shireen, the fact that actually we did a thematic project on conflict, and unfortunately it became a big issue for the region, which of course we would not like it to be, but it became a big issue. I think I can see now that actually the comparative research is actually also responding in a very significant way, that we have this session and then tomorrow's session. I think this is quite interesting. It's something to note, Shireen, to take into account in our stock taking, I think.
Yeah, it's a good laboratory of conflict, our region, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes.
But at least as researchers, we are doing our part in terms
yes, absolutely. Yes. We should. Yes, of course.
And then there's a very, very special invitation to our special panel on next Thursday, which is all about conflict and the conflict program that ERF has embarked on a couple of years ago. So I think that's a not to miss type activity. So please do pencil that in for your diary, and you'd have a chance to hear about it, to hear all about it actually from Dr. Ibrahim, from Raimondo, Dr. Samir Maqdisi, from all our gurus in that area. So please do mark that session in firmly in your agenda.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Lovely. Bye-bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.